An elderly woman enters a restaurant for coffee, wearing a simple hat. A police officer approaches her aggressively and demands her identification. She is handcuffed in front of everyone, offering no reaction, only silence. Minutes later, the entire country discovers who her son is, and nothing will ever be the same. If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you are watching from. Let's continue. Saturday morning arrived peacefully in Charlotte, North Carolina. The shy sun illuminated the streets of the Dilworth neighborhood, where people walked briskly between coffee shops and stores, beginning to open their doors. The movement was typical of a weekend, that mixture of haste and rest that transforms the city into a living, pulsing organism, full of stories that cross paths without anyone noticing. Cars honked occasionally, newsstands displayed the latest headlines, and the smell of fresh pastry escaped from the bakeries. Everything conspired to create that unique atmosphere of southern mornings, where time seems to move slower, even when everyone is in a rush. Mrs. Eleanor Harrison walked slowly along the sidewalk, clutching her worn brown leather handbag against her body. At 72 years old, she had that serene manner of someone who had lived long enough not to be impressed by others' haste. She wore a simple navy blue cotton dress, a beige cardigan with elbows slightly worn by time, and a straw hat that shielded her face from the morning sun. Her grey hair appeared at the sides, rebellious and authentic without dye or vanity. There was no jewelry on her fingers, only a simple gold wedding band she had worn for nearly 50 years since the day she married Joseph, her husband, who had passed away 5 years ago. His absence still hurt, but Eleanor had learned to live with the loneliness, transforming it into moments of silent contemplation. She stopped in front of Miller's Cafe, a modest establishment that had operated there for over 20 years. The storefront was simple, with faded lettering and formica tables inside. Nothing sophisticated but welcoming. The place had that charm of old establishments, where time seemed to have stopped sometime in the 90s, and no one felt the need to update anything. The walls were decorated with old photos of Charlotte, showing the city in past decades when everything was different, but, in a way, the same. Eleanor pushed the glass door and entered, smelling the familiar aroma of fresh coffee mixed with toasted bread. A few tables were occupied. People talked quietly. Others checked their phones while waiting for their orders. An elderly couple shared a piece of pound cake. 2 young men discussed football with contained passion. The lady chose a corner table near the window. She sat down carefully, placed her bag beside her, and took a deep breath. That was her Saturday ritual. A simple coffee, alone watching the world go by. She didn't need much, just that moment of peace, that instant of normalcy that made her feel part of the ordinary world, far from everything her life had become in recent years, away from the responsibilities, the expectations, and the obligations that came with the last name she carried. There, in that simple cafe, she was just Eleanor, just an ordinary lady having her coffee, and that was liberating. The server, a young man in a white apron, approached with a notepad in hand. Eleanor ordered a latte and a warm blueberry muffin. He noted it down and went back to the counter. While she waited, she looked out the window. She saw a mother holding a small child's hand, a man in a suit talking on the phone, a dog being walked on a leash, lives in motion, stories she would never know. The coffee arrived in a few minutes, steaming, with that scent that calms the soul. Eleanor held the still hot cup between her hands and closed her eyes for a second, feeling the heat move through her skin. It was good to be there. It was good to be invisible. It was good not to have to explain anything to anyone. But the peace was short-lived. The cafe door swung open with force. 2 police officers entered, both in uniform with serious expressions. One was older, with a grey mustache and a rigid posture. The other was younger, with a suspicious gaze that swept the room as if searching for something suspicious. They walked between the tables, observing the customers. Most people looked away, returning to their conversations or phones. No one liked to draw attention. The older officer stopped, his eyes fixed on Eleanor. She was there, quiet, holding her coffee, looking out the window. He furrowed his brow, exchanged a look with his colleague, and walked toward her. His steps were heavy, intentional. The room grew quieter. Some people began to notice. Sergeant Mark Stevens stopped beside Eleanor's table. She raised her eyes slowly, not understanding. Her fingers still held the warm cup. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and she saw something there that made a chill run down her spine. It wasn't just authority. It was contempt. It was judgment. It was the arrogant certainty of someone who thinks they can judge another human being by their appearance. "Take off that hat and show me your ID, now." His voice cut through the room like a blade. Dry, authoritative, too loud for such a small place. The entire cafe froze. Conversations ceased instantly. Silverware stopped mid-air. A heavy, uncomfortable silence spread through the tables. Everyone looked. The elderly couple stopped eating. The young men discussing football turned around. A young woman with curly hair widened her eyes. The server behind the counter gripped his dish towel tightly, unsure if he should intervene. Eleanor blinked, confused. Her heart began to beat faster, but she maintained her composure. "Excuse me, I'm just having my coffee," she replied in a low but firm voice. "I didn't ask what you were doing. I ordered you to take off that hat and show me your documents now." His tone rose even higher, aggressive, intimidating. Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. She placed the cup on the table slowly and opened her bag, looking for her wallet. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from contained indignation. The officer crossed his arms, impatient. "Why is it taking so long? Do you have something to hide?" "No, sir. I am just looking for my ID." The second officer, Officer Ryan Alden, approached as well. Younger, more tense, with his hand already near the baton on his belt. He looked at Eleanor with suspicion, as if she represented some kind of threat. The scene was absurd. An elderly lady, dressed simply, being treated like a criminal. "Look, we don't have all day. If you don't cooperate, we're going to have to take you to the station for questioning." Eleanor finally found her wallet. She pulled out the ID and held it out to Sergeant Stevens. He took the document roughly, glanced at it, and handed it back without saying a word. But he didn't leave. He stayed there, standing, looking at her with a mix of contempt and misapplied authority. "Dressed like that, you shouldn't be here. This place is for decent people." His words fell like stones on the table. Eleanor felt her chest tighten. It wasn't fear. It was humiliation. She raised her chin and looked him in the eye. "I am a decent person, and I have every right to be here." The sergeant gave a cruel half-smile. He grabbed the radio on his shoulder and keyed it. "Dispatch, this is Unit 357. Requesting backup at Miller's Cafe, Dilworth. Suspect refusing to cooperate." The radio crackled an inaudible response. Eleanor felt her heart race. This was spiraling out of control. She hadn't done anything. She just wanted to have her coffee. She just wanted a moment of peace. "I already showed my ID. I am not refusing anything," she said, keeping her voice steady. "We'll be the judges of that." Meanwhile, at a table near the window, a man with glasses and messy hair watched everything in silence. Brian Sanders was 38 years old and worked as an investigative journalist for a digital news portal. He was there by chance having coffee while reviewing stories on his laptop. But when he saw the way the officers approached the elderly woman, his professional instinct kicked in. He knew that kind of situation. Abuse of authority disguised as law enforcement. Discreetly, Brian took out his phone and started recording. Perfect angle. Clear audio. He knew this could be important. Perhaps very important. The cafe door opened again. Another officer rushed in, younger than the first two, with a tense face. Officer Felix Carter looked at the sergeant, who made a gesture toward Eleanor. The officer walked over to her without asking anything, without seeking clarification, simply following orders. "Ma'am, please stand up slowly and keep your hands where I can see them. But I haven't done anything, I'm just having coffee. We'll clear that up at the station. Stand up." Eleanor obeyed. She stood up slowly, with dignity, without raising her voice, without making a scene. But inside, something screamed. The officer took the handcuffs from his belt. Some people in the cafe put their hands to their mouths. A cup fell to the floor and shattered. The server behind the counter froze, not knowing what to do. "This isn't necessary," Eleanor said softly. "Standard procedure." The handcuffs closed on her wrists with a metallic click. Cold, final, humiliating. Eleanor closed her eyes for a second, taking a deep breath. She felt the cold metal against her wrinkled skin, felt the weight of injustice tightening her chest. She thought of her son, how furious he would be if he knew. She thought of her late husband, how he would have reacted. She thought of all the times in her life she had to swallow smaller humiliations, minor discriminations, looks of disdain. But this was different. This crossed all limits. The coffee she had waited for so long was forgotten on the table, still warm, still untouched. A small cloud of steam rose from the dark liquid, indifferent to the drama unfolding. The straw hat remained on her head, a silent witness to an injustice unfolding without restraint. Sergeant Stevens grabbed her arm with excessive firmness and began to lead her out. Eleanor walked with her head held high, refusing to look down. She had done nothing wrong. She would not bow. She would not allow these men to steal her dignity, even if they could temporarily steal her freedom. As she crossed the room, she felt everyone's eyes on her. Pity, shock, contained anger. The girl with curly hair had tears in her eyes. The elderly couple looked on with expressions of horror. But no one moved. No one said anything. They just watched, trapped in that collective paralysis that happens when we witness an injustice but don't know how to react. Outside, a patrol car was parked in front of the cafe. Sirens off, but an imposing presence. People on the street stopped to look. Some took out phones and started taking pictures. There was curiosity in the eyes of some, indignation in others. Eleanor was placed in the back seat of the patrol car. The door closed with a dry thud, isolating her from the outside world. Inside the car, she remained silent. She looked out the window, watching the city pass as the car moved through the streets. Charlotte remained alive, indifferent to what had just happened. People walked, buses passed. The sun rose in the sky. Everything normal, everything the same. But for Eleanor, something had changed. She felt a deep sadness, not for herself, but for humanity. How was it possible for someone to judge another human being just by the clothes they wore? How was it possible for authority to be confused with arrogance? She thought of how many other people had already gone through similar situations, perhaps worse, without having a voice, without having resources, without having someone to defend them. And she felt a responsibility growing inside her. If this was happening to her, who had the means to defend herself? What happened to those who had nothing? Meanwhile, inside the cafe, Brian Sanders stopped recording on his phone. He reviewed the video quickly. Perfect. Clear audio, sharp images. He knew exactly what to do. He opened his messaging app and sent the video to 3 journalist colleagues. Then he opened Twitter and posted a short clip with the caption, "Abuse of authority in broad daylight. Mrs. Eleanor Harrison, a customer at Miller's Cafe, handcuffed for no reason. Hashtag Justice for Eleanor." In less than 5 minutes, the video began to circulate. Shares, indignant comments, tags. Social media has a short memory, but when something touches the right wound, the reaction is immediate. And this touched it. In the patrol car, Eleanor remained quiet. Sergeant Stevens drove in silence, occasionally exchanging looks with Officer Alden. They didn't know it, but at that exact moment, their careers were about to change forever. The precinct was in the city center, an old building with light-colored walls and hallways that smelled of old paper and reheated coffee. When the car parked, Eleanor was escorted inside. They passed the reception desk, where an attendant looked up and returned to her computer without saying anything. They went up 2 flights of stairs to a small, windowless room with a metal table and 3 chairs. "Sit down," the sergeant ordered. Eleanor sat. The handcuffs were still on her wrists. She didn't complain. She just waited. Officer Alden left the room, leaving the sergeant alone with her. He began to fill out a report, scratching the paper with excessive force, as if he were irritated. Full name: Eleanor Marie Harrison. Address: 234 Acacia Drive, Myers Park. The sergeant noted it down without looking at her. He continued asking bureaucratic questions, noting down mechanical answers. Eleanor answered everything calmly, without changing her tone of voice. She knew this was a mistake, a grave mistake, and she knew that eventually the truth would come out. Meanwhile, at the precinct reception, the phone rang. The attendant, Chloe Miller, answered in her usual monotonous tone. "Central Precinct, good morning." The voice on the other end was tense, urgent. Chloe furrowed her brow and sat up straight in her chair. "Yes, sir. I understand. I will check immediately." She hung up and ran to the computer, typing rapidly. She entered the name Eleanor Marie Harrison into the system. The screen loaded for a few seconds. When the data appeared, Chloe turned pale. Her eyes widened. She reread the information 3 times to be sure. "My God!" She stood up in a hurry, nearly knocking over her chair, and ran upstairs. She knocked on the door of the office where Captain Anthony Collins, her immediate superior, was. "Sir, I need to speak with you now. It's urgent." The captain looked up from his papers, irritated by the interruption. "What is it, Chloe?" "The lady who just arrived, Eleanor Marie Harrison, you need to see this." She held out a printed sheet with the system data. The captain took it and began to read. As his eyes scanned the lines, his expression changed. Surprise, then worry. Finally, absolute alarm. "Call the chief. Now!" Chloe ran out. The captain reread the data, taking a deep breath. This was much bigger than he imagined. Much, much bigger. The room at the station was cold and impersonal. Walls painted a faded green, a fluorescent light that flickered occasionally, and a scratched metal table in the center. Eleanor remained seated, handcuffs still on her wrists, watching Sergeant Stevens fill out forms with irritating slowness. He noted every piece of information as if it were a common, routine process, without any moral weight regarding what he had just done. Across the table, Officer Alden leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, looking at the elderly woman with a mix of boredom and suspicion. He saw nothing wrong with what they had done. To him, it was just another day at work. One more stop, one more suspect brought in for questioning. The simple clothes, the straw hat, the quiet posture, everything conspired to make him judge her before even knowing her. Eleanor, for her part, remained calm. She didn't cry, she didn't beg, she didn't despair. She had already been through difficult things in life. She had lost her husband, faced illnesses, overcome losses that many could not bear. This was different. It was unjust. It was humiliating. But she knew that the truth would eventually come out. It always did. Sergeant Stevens entered her data into the system and waited. The old computer screen loaded slowly, spinning that irritating circle that indicated processing. He drummed his fingers on the table, impatient. Officer Alden yawned. Neither of them imagined what was about to happen. Meanwhile, outside the precinct, the world was already in motion. Brian Sanders' video had exploded on social media. In just 30 minutes, it already had over 50,000 views on Twitter. Comments multiplied every second. People were indignant, revolted, shocked. Hashtags began to emerge organically. Tash justice for Elena. Charlotte abuse. A Hattis not a crime. The story gained its own momentum, fueled by collective anger against injustices many had already experienced or witnessed. Brian Sanders, still at Miller's Cafe, typed frantically on his laptop. He had called journalist colleagues, sent the video to news portals, and contacted social movement leads. He knew this case had the potential to become something much larger, and he was right. In less than an hour, the video was already being shared by large profiles, digital influencers, and even politicians who saw an opportunity to take a stand. Inside the precinct, receptionist Chloe Miller came running, back from Captain Collins' office. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. She carried a printed sheet in her trembling hands and ran up the stairs, nearly tripping over her own feet. She reached the room where Eleanor was being questioned and knocked on the door urgently. Sergeant Stevens looked up, irritated by the interruption. "What is it now?" "I need to speak with you. Now. It's urgent." He sighed, stood up from his chair, and left the room, closing the door behind him. Chloe grabbed his arm tightly. "Sergeant, you need to see this, the woman you brought in. Eleanor Marie Harrison. Look at the data that just came back from the system." She held out the sheet. The sergeant took it with disdain, as if he were wasting time on nonsense. But as his eyes began to scan the information, his expression changed. First, confusion. Then, incredulity. Finally, absolute panic. "This can't be right. It has to be a system error." "It's not an error, Sergeant. I confirmed it 3 times. It's really her." His hands began to shake. The paper nearly fell to the floor. He reread the information, hoping to find some mistake, some detail that proved this was a misunderstanding. But there was no error. Every line confirmed the devastating truth. Eleanor Marie Harrison, 72 years old, resident of Myers Park, Charlotte. Widow of Joseph Harrison, mother of Edward Harrison, Edward Harrison. The name echoed in the sergeant's mind like thunder. He knew that name. Every officer in Charlotte knew it. Edward Harrison was the businessman responsible for the city's largest security technology provider. Communication systems, tracking equipment, criminal analysis software, high-definition cameras. Everything the police used came from his company. More than that, Edward had saved lives. He had invested millions in equipment that allowed rescues in critical situations, the deactivation of threats, and the protection of agents in dangerous operations. Sergeant Stevens felt the floor vanish beneath his feet. "Call the chief. Immediately." Chloe was already running back to the phone. The sergeant returned to the room, trying to control his panic. He looked at Eleanor, who remained seated, calm, with the handcuffs still on her wrists. She raised her eyes and stared at him. There was no anger in her gaze, only a deep sadness and a disappointment that cut deeper than any scream. Officer Alden noticed the tension. "What is it?" "Sergeant, did something happen?" "Shut up." The sharpness of the response caught Alden by surprise. He fell silent, but unease began to grow within him. Something was wrong, very wrong. 15 minutes later, the precinct door opened with force. Chief Marcus Taylor entered, accompanied by 2 high-ranking officers. He was 58 years old, with closely cropped grey hair, impeccable military posture, and a presence that silenced any room. All the officers in the reception area stood up automatically as he passed. Conversations ceased. The air became heavier. Chief Taylor walked up the stairs with firm steps, his face set in an expression that mixed seriousness and worry. He reached the room where Eleanor was and opened the door without knocking. He entered, looked around, and his eyes finally landed on the elderly woman sitting there, handcuffed, with her straw hat still on her head. Time stopped. The chief took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a second as if he needed to compose himself, and then did something that shocked everyone present. He walked over to Eleanor, stopped before her, and knelt. His right knee touched the cold concrete floor with a dry sound that echoed through the silent room. Sergeant Stevens and Officer Alden stood paralyzed, not understanding what was happening. The chief, the man who represented the ultimate authority, was on his knees before a woman they had treated like a criminal. "Chief, what are you doing?" The chief's voice came out low but laden with contained emotion. "Mrs. Harrison, I ask for your forgiveness on behalf of this institution. This should never have happened." Eleanor looked at him with a mixture of surprise and understanding. She knew this man. Edward, her son, had mentioned his name several times. Marcus Taylor, the chief who always expressed gratitude for the equipment, who recognized how much the technology provided had saved lives, who deeply respected Edward's work. "Chief, please, stand up. This is no place for that." He stood up slowly, still visibly moved. Then he turned to the 2 officers, and the expression on his face changed completely. Gentleness gave way to contained fury. "Is someone going to explain to me how it is possible that the mother of the man who equips our entire police force is handcuffed in this precinct as if she were a criminal?" Sergeant Stevens swallowed hard. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Officer Alden looked at the floor, unable to face the chief. "I asked a question." His voice thundered through the room. It echoed through the hallways. Other officers approached the door, curious, frightened. "Sir, we were conducting a routine stop at Miller's Cafe. She was dressed suspiciously and—" Suspiciously. What exactly does dressed suspiciously mean? A simple dress? A straw hat? Modest clothes? The sergeant tried to continue, but the chief interrupted him. "You handcuffed a 72-year-old woman who offered no resistance, who had committed no crime, simply because you judged her appearance. You violated every protocol of engagement, humiliated a citizen for no reason, and still had the audacity to bring her here as if she were a criminal." The silence that followed was deafening. The chief took a deep breath, trying to control his anger. Then he turned to Eleanor again. "Take those handcuffs off her, now!" Sergeant Stevens obeyed with trembling hands. He opened the handcuffs, and they fell to the floor with a metallic sound. Eleanor massaged her wrists slowly, feeling the relief from the pressure. Red marks remained on her skin where the metal had tightened. "Mrs. Harrison, you have every right to sue this institution, every right, and I would not blame you if you did." She looked at him with those serene eyes, full of wisdom accumulated over decades. "Chief, I don't want to sue anyone. I want this to serve as a lesson, so that other people don't go through what I went through, because if this happened to me, who has resources and a voice, imagine those who have nothing." Her words cut deeper than any formal accusation could. The chief nodded, feeling the weight of the truth in those simple sentences. Outside the precinct, a small crowd had already begun to form. People who saw the video on social media, human rights activists, journalists from various outlets. TV cameras were already being set up. Signs began to appear. Social pressure grew every minute. Inside the room, the chief turned to the two officers. "You are suspended, effective immediately. There will be a full investigation, and depending on the results, you will face administrative and possibly criminal charges for abuse of authority." Officer Alden turned pale. Sergeant Stevens felt his legs weaken. Reality began to crash down on them like a crushing weight. Their careers, their reputations, their lives, all threatened by a few minutes of arrogance and prejudice. Eleanor stood up slowly, adjusted her cardigan, and put her bag on her shoulder. She looked at the two officers who had humiliated her and, for a moment, felt something close to pity. Not because they didn't deserve consequences, but because she saw in them the reflection of a larger system, a rooted culture of judging people by appearance, of confusing authority with the power to humiliate. "Chief, I would like to go home now." "Of course, Mrs. Harrison. I will take you myself." They left the room together. They walked down the stairs in silence. When they reached the reception area, all the officers present stood up in a show of automatic but belated respect. Eleanor passed them without saying anything, maintaining the dignified posture she had never lost, not even when handcuffed. Upon leaving the precinct, she was greeted by the flash of cameras and shouts of support from the small crowd already gathered. "Justice for Eleanor!" "Never again!" "Respect our elders!" The voices blended into a chorus of collective indignation. Brian Sanders was there, camera in hand. When he saw Eleanor leaving accompanied by the chief, he knew he had another important part of the story. He kept recording. Chief Taylor led Eleanor to an official vehicle. He opened the back door for her with kindness, waited for her to settle in, and sat beside the driver. As the car pulled away from the precinct, he turned to her. "Mrs. Harrison, I have met your son on several occasions. Edward is an exceptional man. His work has saved countless lives. The technology he provided allowed us to carry out operations that would have been impossible otherwise. The gratitude I have for him is immense, and knowing that his mother went through this at the hands of my subordinates is something I will carry with great pain." She looked at him with understanding. "Chief, my son doesn't need to know about this. He already has so many worries." "With all due respect, Mrs. Harrison, but I think the whole world already knows. The video is on every social network. Even the news is already covering it." Eleanor sighed. She knew Edward would be furious, not for her, but for the injustice. Her son had inherited that sharp sense of justice from his father, that inability to accept wrongdoing without reacting. And she knew that when he found out there would be consequences. The car followed the streets of Charlotte toward the Myers Park neighborhood. The sun was already higher in the sky, illuminating the city that continued its normal rhythm, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded in the last few hours. Eleanor looked out the window, seeing people walking, living their lives, each carrying their own stories, their own burdens. When they reached her house, a beautiful residence with a well-kept garden, the chief got out and opened the door for her. Eleanor stepped out of the car with her usual dignity. "Thank you, Chief." "You have nothing to thank me for, Ma'am. It is I who apologize again." She nodded and walked toward the gate. The chief remained there, watching her enter the house, carrying the weight of the institutional shame that morning had created. Inside her home, Eleanor took off her hat, placed her bag on the sofa, and went to the kitchen. She prepared a new pot of coffee, this time in peace, without interruptions. But as she drank the hot, bitter liquid, she knew this was far from over. Edward Harrison was in a meeting when his phone began to vibrate insistently. He glanced at the screen, saw several notifications appearing at once, and furrowed his brow. At 45, Edward was a man of striking presence. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark hair with a few grey strands at the temples, intense brown eyes he had inherited from his mother. He wore an impeccable navy blue suit and commanded that boardroom with the same natural authority he applied to all aspects of his life. The meeting was taking place on the 12th floor of the Harrison Tech Solutions corporate building, the company he had founded 15 years ago. Around the glass table, 5 executives presented quarterly reports, growth projections, and expansion proposals. Edward listened attentively, asking specific questions and making observations, but the phone's vibrations wouldn't stop. "Excuse me," he said, picking up the device. He unlocked the screen and saw dozens of WhatsApp messages, missed calls, Twitter notifications, urgent emails. His heart raced. Something was wrong. Very wrong. He opened the messaging app and saw an alarming sequence of texts from friends, colleagues, and even clients. "Edward, did you see what happened to your mother? Man, this is everywhere. Are you seeing this? How absurd. Mrs. Harrison didn't deserve this." He felt his blood run cold. He opened Twitter with hands that were already starting to shake. The timeline was flooded. The video was everywhere. He clicked and watched. He saw his mother, alone in that simple cafe, being approached aggressively. He saw the officer screaming at her. He saw the public humiliation. He saw the handcuffs being placed on her delicate wrists. Edward felt a wave of fury so intense he had to steady himself on the table to keep from losing control. His hands clenched into fists. His jaw tightened. His eyes grew red, not with tears but with pure, absolute rage. "The meeting is over. Leave, everyone." "But sir, we still have—" "I said it is over." His voice exploded through the room. The executives rushed out, grabbing laptops and folders, leaving in silence. The door closed, leaving Edward alone. He watched the video again and again. Each viewing fueled the growing fury within him. He picked up the phone and dialed his mother's number. It rang 3 times. No one answered. He dialed again. Nothing. Panic began to mix with the rage. Where was she? Was she okay? Was she hurt? He called her home landline. It rang several times until finally a voice answered. "Hello? Mom? Mom, are you okay? What happened?" "Edward, my son. I am fine. Just tired." "What do you mean, tired? I saw the video. I saw everything. Those bastards handcuffed you. They treated you like a criminal." "Edward, please don't get upset. It's over. I'm home. I'm fine." "It's not over. This won't stand. I'm going to sue those officers. I'm going to sue the whole department. I'm going to make them pay for every second of humiliation they caused you." "My son, listen. I know you're angry. I understand, but revenge won't solve anything." "It's not revenge, Mom. It's justice." On the other end of the line, Eleanor sighed. She knew her son too well. She knew that when Edward decided something, nothing in the world would make him change his mind. He had inherited that fierce determination from his father, that inability to accept injustice without reacting. "Edward, Promise me you won't do anything rash." "I promise I will do everything within the law, but I will do it, Mom. This cannot go unpunished." He hung up, breathing heavily. He walked to the office window and looked at the city below. Charlotte stretched out before him, busy, full of life. Somewhere out there, police officers thought they could humiliate innocent people without consequence. They thought authority meant unlimited power. They were about to find out they were very mistaken. Edward picked up the phone again and called his personal lawyer, Dr. Henry Miller, one of the most respected criminal attorneys in North Carolina. "Henry, I need you in my office now." "Edward, I'm in a hearing. Can it wait until—" "It can't wait. It's about my mother." "Have you seen the video?" There was a pause on the other end. "I have. Half the country has by now. I'll cancel the hearing. I'll be there in 20 minutes. While he waited, Edward began making calls. First to the State Secretary of Public Safety, with whom he had direct contact due to commercial partnerships. Then to investigative journalists he knew, then to human rights organizations. He was putting together a strategy, mobilizing resources, preparing the ground for a response that would be impossible to ignore. 23 minutes later, Dr. Henry Miller entered the office. He was 60 years old, with completely white hair, gold-rimmed glasses, and an impeccable reputation built over 3 decades of career. He carried a leather briefcase and a serious expression. "Edward, I saw the full video. This is a flagrant abuse of authority. We have a solid case." "I want more than a solid case, Henry. I want them to pay. All of them. The officers, the superiors who allowed this culture, the system that thinks it can judge people by appearance." "Let's go slow. First, we need to hear your mother's version. Then gather all the evidence. The video is already powerful evidence, but we need more. Witnesses, precinct documentation, the history of these officers. I want criminal action against them. I want them to lose their jobs. I want them to understand they can't do this to anyone, ever again." Henry nodded, taking notes. "We will sue for abuse of authority, false imprisonment, illegal arrest and emotional distress. This could result in jail time for those involved and a substantial settlement for your mother." "My mother doesn't want money. She made that clear. She wants this to serve as an example. Then let's propose something different. Instead of a financial settlement, we can demand that the case be used as the basis for a reform of police protocols, mandatory training on respectful engagement, courses on unconscious bias, stricter supervision." Edward considered it. It made sense. It was more aligned with what his mother wanted. It wasn't about money, it was about real change. "Do that, but I want the officers held accountable too. Personally. They will be, I guarantee it." While the two talked, the repercussions of the case continued to grow exponentially. The video already had over 2 million views. TV shows were beginning to comment. Politicians were making statements. Social movements organized protests. The #Justice for Alina was a national trending topic. At the Central Precinct, the atmosphere was like a funeral. Officers walked through the hallways in silence, avoiding eye contact with one another. Sergeant Stevens and Officer Alden were in a separate room, waiting for the start of the administrative process. Neither had eaten since morning. Neither could fully process what had happened. Chief Marcus Taylor was in his office, on the phone with the Secretary of Public Safety, trying to control the institutional damage. But with every passing minute, it became clearer that this was out of control. "Secretary, I understand. The gravity. I've already suspended the officers involved and initiated an internal investigation, but I need support from the department. This goes beyond a simple correction." On the other end of the line, Secretary Robert Anderson, an experienced politician of 62, responded in a tense voice. "Chief, do you have any idea of the damage this is causing? The press is all over it. The opposition is using this as ammunition. And worst of all, her son is Edward Harrison. The Edward Harrison. Half of our equipment comes from his company." "I know who he is, Secretary, and I know this will have enormous consequences." "Consequences? This is going to be a disaster. Prepare yourself, because there will be a congressional inquiry, a Department of Justice investigation, a full audit, And if we don't show exemplary punishment, we're going to lose all credibility. I understand, sir. And there's more. I received a call from Edward Harrison himself an hour ago. He is furious. He talked about cancelling all contracts with the government if there isn't complete justice. The chief closed his eyes. This was worse than he imagined. If Edward cancelled the contracts, the police would be left without critical systems. Operations would be compromised. Lives could be lost. What do you want me to do? Remove the officers involved immediately, not just a suspension, a total removal, and prepare a full report for the district attorney. We are going to be transparent to the extreme. It's the only chance to minimize the damage. Yes, sir. The chief hung up and sank into his chair. His 30-year career was being tested like never before, and the worst part was that he knew the officers under his command had acted wrongly, completely wrongly. Meanwhile, at Eleanor's house, she was sitting on the porch, drinking chamomile tea and looking at the garden. The hydrangeas she had planted years ago were in bloom, in shades of blue and pink. The day was beautiful, with a gentle breeze moving the leaves of the trees. It seemed like an ordinary day. But it wasn't. She thought about everything that had happened, the humiliation, the way she was treated, the looks from the people in the cafe. But she also thought about all the other people who went through similar situations every day, without anyone filming, without anyone caring. How many times did this happen? Silently. How many lives were marked by these small institutionalized violences? The gate opened. Edward entered in a hurry, crossed the garden in long strides, and climbed the porch steps. When he saw his mother there, sitting peacefully, something inside him broke. He knelt beside her and hugged her tightly. "Mom, I'm so sorry I wasn't there. Edward, my son, you are not to blame for anything. But I should have been there. I should have protected you." She pulled back a bit to look into his eyes. "You can't protect me from everything, and I don't need protection. I need this kind of thing to stop happening to anyone. It will stop, Mom, I promise it will stop." He told her about the measures he was taking, the lawsuit, the conversations with authorities. Eleanor listened in silence, seeing the fierce determination in her son's eyes. He was just like his father. Joseph would have reacted exactly the same way. "Edward, I don't want revenge. I want change." "I know, Mom, and that's exactly what we're going to get. But for real change to happen, there need to be real consequences. Otherwise, nothing changes." She nodded. She knew he was right. Consequences were necessary. Not out of cruelty, but for justice, for all the other people who had no voice. That night, the story was the headline in all the major newspapers. Television programs opened with the case. Experts debated abuse of authority, institutional prejudice, and the need for police reform. Society was waking up to a reality many preferred to ignore. At Edward's house, he worked late, answering emails, coordinating strategies, planning the next steps. His wife Julia entered the office with a cup of coffee. "You need to rest, honey." "I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see those handcuffs on my mother's wrists." Julia sat beside him and took his hand. "She's okay. She's strong. Stronger than all of us put together." "I know. But that doesn't lessen the anger I feel. Use that anger to do something productive. You're already doing it, but don't let it consume you." Edward looked at his wife. Julia always had that ability to bring clarity in the most turbulent moments. He took a deep breath. "You're right. I'm going to sleep. There's a lot of work ahead tomorrow." They went to the bedroom, but Edward took hours to fall asleep. His mind wouldn't stop working, planning, strategizing, looking for ways to ensure that this resulted in real change. The next day, the district attorney's office announced it would open an official investigation into the case. The Department of Justice also spoke out. The Bar Association issued a note of condemnation. The pressure on the police institution was immense. Sergeant Stevens and Officer Alden were formally indicted for abuse of authority. Their careers were ruined. Their families faced social stigma. But more than that, they were beginning to understand truly what they had done. In a provisional detention cell, Sergeant Stevens sat on the cold floor and let the tears flow. For the first time in many years, he saw himself clearly, without the masks of authority and power. and he didn't like what he saw. 3 weeks had passed since that morning at Miller's Cafe. Eleanor's case had become a watershed moment in the discussion of abuse of authority in the United States. What started as a viral video had become a national movement for reform in the public safety system. Edward Harrison was in a conference room at the Justice Center, surrounded by lawyers, representatives from the district attorney's office, and members of human rights organizations. The table was covered with documents, reports, and proposals. In recent days, he had dedicated himself entirely to transforming indignation into concrete action. Dr. Henry Miller led the meeting with the precision of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms. "Gentlemen, we have here an emblematic case that can serve as a precedent for structural changes. The video is irrefutable evidence. We also have testimony from eyewitnesses, psychological analysis of the victim attesting to emotional trauma, and most importantly, we gained access to the precinct's internal records showing a pattern of similar stops over the last 5 years. One of the representatives from the district attorney's office, Dr. Patricia Lewis, a black woman in her 40s with a serious expression, flipped through the documents. This is even more serious than we imagined. The data shows that 63% of stops considered excessive were directed at people in vulnerable social situations: the elderly, the homeless, manual laborers. There is a clear pattern of discrimination based on appearance." Edward clenched his fists. Each number, each statistic represented a humiliated person, a wounded dignity. His mother hadn't been the first, but if it depended on him, she would be the last. "What can we do concretely to change this?" Dr. Miller responded. "We are proposing a legal settlement. The officers involved will be permanently removed and will face criminal charges for abuse of authority. Furthermore, the police department will commit to implementing a comprehensive re-education and reform program." Edward shook his head. "It's not enough. Removing 2 officers doesn't change the culture that allowed this. We need something bigger." Dr. Lewis agreed. "Exactly, that's why we are proposing the creation of a pilot program called the Harrison Protocol. It will be a set of mandatory guidelines for all police stops in the state, focusing on respect, dignity, and a real presumption of innocence, not just a theoretical one." Edward leaned forward, interested. "Go on." "The program will include mandatory quarterly training on unconscious bias, nonviolent engagement techniques, respectful communication, and legal consequences for discrimination. Additionally, every police stop will be recorded by body cameras without exception. The recordings will be available for public audit." "There will be resistance," commented one of the lawyers present. "There certainly will be," Edward replied, "but I don't care. This needs to happen." While the meeting continued across the city at Miller's Cafe, something was changing too. The establishment that was once just another common cafe had become a symbol. People came from all over the city to see the place where it all happened. The owner, Mr. Arthur Miller, a 58-year-old man who had run the cafe for over 2 decades, could barely process the transformation. He had placed a small, discreet plaque near the table where Eleanor was that day. The words were simple, but powerful. "Dignity is not judged by appearance. Respect is everyone's right." That afternoon, Eleanor decided to return to the cafe, not because she had to prove anything, but because she refused to allow that experience to steal from her one of the few simple pleasures she still had. Edward offered to accompany her, but she gently refused. This was something she needed to do alone. When she entered Miller's Cafe wearing the same simple dress and the same straw hat, the entire room stopped. All conversations ceased. Everyone turned. For a moment, the silence was absolute. Then, one person began to clap, another joined in, and another. In seconds, the whole cafe was on its feet, applauding. Eleanor felt her eyes well up, but she maintained her composure. She nodded her head in thanks and walked to the same table where it had all begun. She sat down carefully and placed her bag beside her. Mr. Miller personally came to take her order. "Mrs. Harrison, it is an honor to have you back. The coffee is on the house, it always will be." "Very kind, Mr. Miller, but I prefer to pay. I want everything to be exactly as it was before." He smiled, understanding. He brought the latte and the blueberry muffin. This time she could drink in, peace, savoring every sip, observing the people, feeling part of the world again. At a nearby table, Brian Sanders, the journalist who had recorded the original video, observed the scene. He wasn't there by chance. In recent weeks, he had dedicated himself to investigating similar cases, transforming that episode into a series of reports on abuse of authority. His work was generating important debates, opening space for conversations that were previously swept under the rug. He approached Eleanor with respect. "Mrs. Harrison, my name is Brian Sanders. I was the one who recorded the video that day." She looked at him with those serene eyes. "I know who you are. I read your reports. They are important." "Thank you. I wanted to apologize if the exposure caused any discomfort." "It didn't. You did what was right. Sometimes the truth needs to be seen to be believed." Brian smiled, relieved. "Can I ask you a question? Why did you decide to come back here?" "Because I cannot allow those minutes of humiliation to steal from me something I love. This cafe is part of my routine, my life. If I stop coming, I would be giving them a power they don't, that is deserved to have." The answer was simple but profound. Brian made mental notes, knowing those words deserved to be shared. Meanwhile, in a therapy room in downtown Charlotte, former Sergeant Mark Stevens was sitting in an uncomfortable armchair, facing a psychologist named Dr. Sarah Campbell. It was part of the legal settlement. To have any chance of redemption, he would need to go through mandatory therapy, confront his prejudices, and understand the roots of his behavior. "Mark, tell me about that day." He sighed heavily. He had told that story so many times in recent weeks that the words came out automatically. "I saw a woman dressed simply. I judged that she was out of place. I acted based on that judgment." "And why did you think she was out of place?" Because she didn't seem to belong in that environment." "What does belong mean?" The question left him without an answer. For the first time, he really stopped to think about what those words meant. Who decides who belongs where? Based on what? Clothes? Appearance? Social class? "I don't know," he admitted, and for the first time there was genuine honesty in his voice. That is the first step, Mark. Recognizing that you don't know, because no one has the right to decide that for another person. In the following weeks, he began to understand things he had never questioned. The unconscious biases he carried, the automatic assumptions, the way he had been trained to see the world divided between us and them. It was a painful process, like pulling scabs off an old wound, but necessary. Officer Ryan Alden was going through a similar process. Younger, he had more difficulty accepting responsibility. He still tried to justify himself, blame the system, say he was just following orders. But slowly, through therapy sessions and the testimonies he was forced to read from other victims of police abuse, something began to change inside him too. Meanwhile, the Harrison Protocol began to take shape. There were months of discussions, adjustments, resistance, and progress. Older officers opposed it, claiming the new rules would make work harder. But a new generation of officers saw it as an opportunity to rebuild the relationship between the police and society. Chief Marcus Taylor became one of the program's greatest advocates. He knew his own career was stained by what happened under his command. But perhaps, just perhaps, he could use the time he had left to ensure real changes happened. At a press conference at the state capitol, Secretary of Public Safety Robert Anderson officially announced the implementation of the Harrison Protocol. Starting today, all police units in the state will be subject to new engagement guidelines. Body cameras will be mandatory, training will happen quarterly, and most importantly, we will create an independent channel for reporting abuse, managed by civil society organizations, not the police themselves. Edward was in the audience beside his mother. When her name was mentioned, several cameras turned toward them. Eleanor maintained her usual discreet posture, but Edward could see a quiet pride in her eyes. Not personal pride, but pride in seeing that something good was being born from something so painful. After the press conference, several reporters surrounded Edward. "Mr. Harrison, how do you feel seeing these changes happen?" "I feel it's just the beginning. A protocol doesn't change a culture overnight, but it's an important step. and we will remain vigilant to ensure it is implemented for real, not just on paper. Has your mother commented on the settlement? My mother never wanted the spotlight. She wanted change, and change is happening. That is enough for her. That night at Eleanor's house, the family gathered. Edward, his wife Julia, their 2 teenage children, and Eleanor herself. The table was set for dinner with home-cooked food made by the matriarch herself. She had insisted on cooking, saying she needed normalcy, routine, the things that made her who she always was. During dinner, Michael, the eldest grandson of 15, asked, "Grandma, weren't you angry at those officers?" Eleanor chewed slowly before answering. "I was, my dear. I was very angry. But anger is like poison. If you hold it for too long, it destroys you from the inside. So I decided to transform that anger into something productive." "But they hurt you," insisted the younger granddaughter, Lauren, 12. "Yes, they hurt me. But do you know what would hurt more? If I let that transform me into someone bitter, full of hate, or if I did nothing to prevent it from happening to other people." Edward looked at his mother with renewed admiration. She was the strongest person he knew, not for physical strength but for strength of character, for the ability to go through storms and come out. The other side still whole, still compassionate, still human. "Mom, thank you." "For what, son?" "For teaching me what it really means to be strong." She smiled and squeezed his hand. "You learned from your father. He was like that. Firm when he needed to be, but never cruel. Just, but compassionate." The conversation continued through the night, light and comforting. And for the first time in weeks, everyone there could breathe a little easier, knowing that something was changing, slowly but changing. 2 months later, the first group of officers completed the Harrison Protocol training. The graduation took place in the Police Academy auditorium. Eleanor was invited to speak. She hesitated for days, but Edward convinced her that her voice was important. When she stepped onto the stage, before 300 uniformed officers, she felt the weight of their gazes. Some were respectful, others curious, some perhaps resentful. But she took a deep breath and began to speak. "Officers, I am here today not to judge you, but to share an experience. That day in the cafe, I wasn't treated as a citizen. I was treated as a suspect. Not because I did something wrong, but because someone decided, based on my appearance, that I didn't deserve respect." The auditorium was in absolute silence. "I know your job is difficult. I know you face dangers most of us will never face. But that doesn't justify judging people before you know them. It doesn't justify humiliation. It doesn't justify forgetting that every person you stop is someone. They are someone's child, someone's parent. They have a story. They have dignity." Some officers looked down, uncomfortable. Others kept their eyes fixed on her. "What I ask of you is not perfection, it is awareness. It is to stop for a second before you act and ask, am I treating this person the way I would want someone to treat my mother, my child, myself? If the answer is no, then something is wrong." When she finished speaking, there was a brief silence. Then, slowly, applause began. Not everyone, but many. And in those claps there was recognition, there was acceptance, there was a promise to try to be better. Eleanor stepped off the stage and returned to her seat beside Edward. He held her hand, proud. "You were incredible, Mom. I just told the truth. It's what I've always done." 6 months had passed since that morning that changed everything. Autumn had arrived in Charlotte, bringing cooler temperatures and a deep blue sky that framed the city like a painting. The trees in the Dilworth neighborhood were beginning to lose their leaves, creating golden carpets on the sidewalks. And at Miller's Cafe, life continued but transformed. Eleanor maintained her Saturday ritual. Every week at the same time, wearing simple clothes and her straw hat, she entered that cafe which had become more than just a place to have coffee. It was a symbol, a living reminder that dignity is not negotiable and respect is not judged by appearance. On that specific morning, however, something different was happening. Mr. Arthur Miller had organized a small event. Nothing grand, nothing to draw too much attention. Just a moment of quiet celebration for what that place had become. A space where everyone was welcome, regardless of how they dressed, where they came from, or how much money they had in their pockets. When Eleanor entered, she found the cafe simply decorated. Some flowers on the tables, a homemade cake on the counter, and familiar faces that had become part of her new routine. Brian Sanders was there, now a friend who visited her regularly for conversations that went far beyond journalism. The elderly couple who witnessed it all were there too, as was the young woman with curly hair who had cried that day. "Mrs. Harrison, these months have taught us a lot," began Mr. Miller. "This cafe has existed for 23 years. It has served thousands of coffees, received thousands of people, but it has never had a purpose as clear as it does now, to be a place where everyone is equal, where respect is the most valuable currency." She smiled, touched by the sincere simplicity of those words. She sat at her usual table, and this time her coffee came with a small card. She opened it and read the words written by hand by dozens of regular customers, messages of gratitude, of support, of recognition, each one telling how her story had touched their lives, awakened consciences, and changed perspectives. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city at the police academy, an important ceremony was taking place. 450 officers were graduating from the full Harrison Protocol program. 6 months of intensive training, not just on engagement techniques, but on empathy, humanity, and the true meaning of serving and protecting. Chief Marcus Taylor stepped onto the stage to give the commencement speech. At 60, he knew this would be one of his last significant contributions before retirement, but what a contribution it was. Officers, today you are not just receiving a certificate, you are making a commitment to remember that behind every stop there is a human being with a story, with a family, with dignity. The Harrison Protocol is not just a set of rules, it is a change of mindset. It is choosing to see the person before judging the appearance. He paused, looking at the audience. "I know some of you still resist. You think these guidelines get in the way of the work. But I tell you, based on 3 decades of career, respect does not hinder efficiency. Humanity does not compromise safety. In fact, when the population trusts the police, when they see us as allies and not threats, our work becomes easier, not harder." The applause was genuine. Not everyone clapped with enthusiasm, it's true. Cultural change takes time and there would be resistance for years to come. But something was moving in the right direction. Among the graduates was a young 26-year-old officer named Lucy Alden. She had entered the academy shortly after Eleanor's case became public. For her, the Harrison Protocol was not an imposition. It was the reason she had chosen that career. She wanted to be part of the solution, not the problem. As she received her certificate, Lucy thought of her grandmother, a 78-year-old woman who had worked her whole life as a housekeeper. How many times had her grandmother been treated with contempt because of the simple clothes she wore? How many times had she been judged before even opening her mouth? Lucy had grown up seeing that, and now she had the chance to ensure that other grandmothers, other mothers, other human beings did not go through the same. That afternoon, something extraordinary was scheduled to happen. Edward Harrison had organized a meeting that many thought was impossible, perhaps even imprudent, but Eleanor had insisted. She said there could be no true transformation without forgiveness, and there could be no forgiveness without honest confrontation. In the boardroom of Harrison Tech Solutions, 2 chairs were positioned face to face. Eleanor arrived first, accompanied by Edward and the psychologist, Dr. Sarah Campbell, who would facilitate the meeting. Minutes later, the door opened. Former Sergeant Mark Stevens entered slowly. He had lost weight, had deep circles under his eyes, and an expression that carried the weight of months of therapy, self-reflection, and shame. He no longer wore a uniform. He had been permanently removed from the force. He worked now as an assistant at an NGO that served vulnerable populations, part of his rehabilitation process. When his eyes met Eleanor's, he stopped. For a moment it seemed he would run, but she made a gentle gesture, indicating the chair in front of her. He sat down, unable to look directly at her. Dr. Campbell began. "We are here because Mrs. Harrison believes in restoration, not just punishment. "Mark, the lady is willing to listen to you, but she needs you to be honest. Completely honest." He took a deep breath, and when he finally spoke, his voice was trembling. "Mrs. Harrison, I spent 6 months trying to understand why I did what I did. At first I tried to justify myself. I said I was following protocol, that I had experience, that I knew how to identify suspects. But all of that was a lie. The truth is that I judged you. I judged you because you were dressed simply. I judged you because you were alone. I judged you because at some point in my life I learned to separate people into categories, and I put you in the wrong category." Tears began to run down his face. "I have no excuse. I have no justification. I was cruel to someone who did not deserve cruelty. I took your freedom, your dignity. I treated you as less than human. And the worst part is that it wasn't even the first time. How many other people did I treat like that over the years? How many humiliations caused by my prejudice disguised as authority?" Eleanor listened to him in silence. Edward, beside her, had his fists clenched, but respected the process. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that every day I wake up with the weight of what I did, and every day I try to be minimally better than the man who approached you in that cafe. I work with people I previously would have judged and looked away from. I hear stories from those who suffered at the hands of people like me, and it hurts. It hurts because I know I was that person, and the only way to live with it is to try, in some way, to fix what I broke." The silence that followed was heavy. Eleanor looked at that broken man before her. She saw sincerity. She saw genuine regret. She saw someone who had hit bottom and was trying to climb back up. "Mark," she began in a soft voice, "what you did was wrong, very wrong, and it left marks that will not disappear easily. But I see in your eyes something I didn't see that day. I see humanity. I see recognition of error, and that is already a start." She paused. "I cannot say I forgive you completely. Forgiveness is a process, not an event. But I can say I see your pain, and I believe people can change. I believe you are trying, and that counts." He sobbed, covering his face with his hands. Edward observed his mother's generosity in awe. Even after everything, she could still find compassion. Mark raised his eyes, red from crying. Thank you for receiving me. Thank you for listening, and thank you for believing I can be better." When he left the room, Eleanor remained seated, breathing deeply. Edward approached. "Mom, how do you do it?" "How do I do what, son?" "Have so much strength, so much capacity to forgive." She looked at him with those wise eyes. "It's not strength, Edward. It's weariness. I am tired of carrying anger. I'm tired of seeing the world divided between good and bad. The truth is that we are all capable of good and evil, and the only way to break this cycle is to choose every day to see the humanity in people, even in those who hurt us." That night, the whole family gathered again at Eleanor's house. Julia had prepared a special dinner. Michael and Lauren had made hand-drawn posters celebrating their grandmother. There was laughter. There were stories. There was that comforting feeling of home. During dessert, Michael asked, "Grandma, if you could go back in time and prevent all of this from happening, would you?" Eleanor thought carefully before answering. "It's a difficult question, my dear. The part of me that felt pain, humiliation, and fear would like none of it to have happened. But the part of me that sees the changes that came after, that sees officers being trained differently, that sees people discussing respect and dignity, that sees a man trying to transform himself, that part thinks that maybe, just maybe, it all happened for a reason." "Do you think things are really going to change?" asked Lauren. "They already have changed, honey. Not completely, not perfectly. There will still be injustices, there will still be prejudice, but now there is awareness, there is conversation, there are people trying to be better, and that is already a lot." Weeks later, Eleanor was invited to speak at a national event on police reform in Washington, D.C. She hesitated, as she always hesitated before the spotlight. But Edward convinced her that her voice had weight, had power. In the auditorium, packed with authorities from all over the country, she stepped onto the stage in her simple dress and straw hat. symbols that now had meaning far beyond clothing. My name is Eleanor Marie Harrison. I am a mother, a grandmother, a widow, and a citizen. I am not an activist. I am not a politician. I am not an expert. I am just someone who went through an injustice and decided that it could not be in vain. The auditorium was in absolute silence. What I have learned in these months is that real change doesn't come from anger. It comes from persistence. It doesn't come from revenge. It comes from education. It doesn't come from punishing the wrong. It comes from teaching the right. The Harrison Protocol is not about me. It's about all of us. It's about creating a society where no one is judged by appearance, where authority means protection, not a threat, where every person is treated with the basic dignity that every human being deserves. The applause echoed through the auditorium. People stood up, and at that moment, Eleanor knew that her story, however painful it had been, had planted seeds that would continue to grow long after her. When she returned to Charlotte, a surprise was waiting for her. Miller's Cafe had been renovated, not in a grand way, but with care. New tables, new chairs, but keeping the simple and welcoming essence it always had. And on the main wall, a phrase was engraved in discreet but permanent letters. Authority is not appearance nor a shout, it is character. Eleanor read those words and smiled. They were the same words that had been painted months ago, but now they were engraved in fine wood, permanent, an eternal reminder. The following Saturday she returned to the cafe as she always did. She ordered her latte and blueberry muffin. She sat at her table. She observed the movement. And for the first time in a long time, she felt complete peace. Not because everything was perfect, not because there were no more problems in the world, but because she had done her part. She had transformed pain into purpose. She had used her voice to amplify the voices of those who had none. Brian Sanders, who had become a close friend, sat with her. "Mrs. Harrison, what comes next?" She took a sip of her coffee, pensive. "Next? Next I continue living. I continue coming here on Saturdays. I continue being a grandmother. I continue being myself. The big changes have already begun. Now it's letting them consolidate. It's keeping watch. It's reminding people of what we achieved. But without forgetting to live." He smiled. "You are incredible." "I'm not. I'm just a woman who refused to be invisible." Months turned into years. The Harrison Protocol was adopted in other states. It became a national reference, and then international. Stories of transformation began to emerge. Officers who completely changed the way they worked. Communities that began to trust security forces more. Lives that were spared from unnecessary humiliation. Mark Stevens continued his work at the NGO. He never wore a police uniform again, but he found purpose in helping exactly the people he previously judged, and although he never became friends with Eleanor, there was mutual respect, recognition that both had grown from that experience. Edward expanded his company's programs to include technologies that promoted transparency and police accountability, not just providing equipment, but helping to create systems that protected both citizens and officers from abuse. And Eleanor, she continued being exactly who she always was, a simple lady who loved her Saturday coffee, her grandchildren, and her garden. But now she carried something more. She carried the knowledge that an ordinary person can indeed change the world, not alone, not all at once, but with courage, persistence, and the refusal to accept injustice as normal. On a sunny Saturday, 5 years after that fateful day, Eleanor was celebrating her 77th birthday. Miller's Cafe organized a small celebration. Nothing exaggerated, as she always requested. Just a cake, a few friends, a moment of gratitude. When they asked her to make a speech, she refused, but she agreed to share a few words. "I learned that dignity doesn't need to shout to be heard. I learned that change begins with small acts of courage. I learned that to forgive is not to forget. It is choosing not to let the pain define who we are. And I learned that each of us, no matter how simple, how ordinary, has the power to plant seeds of transformation." She looked around, seeing all those faces that had become part of her journey. "So my wish, not just today but every day, is that each of you remembers, your voice matters, your dignity matters, and never ever let anyone make you feel less than you are. The applause filled the small cafe, and at that moment, everyone there knew they had witnessed something rare. Not just a story of injustice corrected, but a story of genuine transformation, of how the courage of an ordinary woman had changed laws, mentalities, and lives. Eleanor cut the cake, distributed it to everyone, and then returned to her table. She took another sip of coffee. She looked out the window, seeing Charlotte continue its eternal rhythm, and she smiled. A small, discreet smile, but full of peace, because she knew she had won, not by destroying her oppressors, but by transforming the system that allowed the oppression, not by harboring bitterness, but by planting change, not by being exceptional, but by being genuinely deeply human. And sometimes being human is the most powerful way to revolutionize the world. The end. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Mrs. Eleanor Harrison has touched your heart deeply. If you were moved by this journey of dignity, transformation, and silent courage, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment marked you the most. Was it the interrupted coffee? Was it the difficult forgiveness? Was it Mark's transformation? Every day we bring intense stories like this one, which reveal the deepest and truest side of the human soul. Stories that make us reflect on who we are and who we can become. We'll see you in the next episode, with another narrative that will stir your emotions and make you believe that change, however difficult it may seem, is always possible. See you soon.